Title: Black Woman Denied Her Seat. Until the airline CEO recognized her as his boss. She arrived at the gate with a first-class ticket and decades of experience leading from behind the scenes. But when Gabrielle Reyes was quietly bumped from her seat without explanation, she didn't make a scene. She took notes. Why was her seat reassigned, while a late-arriving white passenger was ushered forward with a smile? Why did the flight crew label her disruptive just for asking a question, and who sent her that handwritten note mid-air, the one that said, "People like you don't belong in seats like that"? What the crew didn't know was that Gabrielle wasn't just any passenger. She was one of the airline's top equity stakeholders, and what started as a quiet insult turned into a national reckoning. This isn't just a story about flying. It's a story about standing your ground in the very space they tried to erase you from. It's about dignity, justice, and the calm power of knowing who you are. So get ready for a story that will shake you, stir you, and maybe even change how you see the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's dive into the full story. The hum of jet engines pulsed gently in the background, like a heartbeat keeping rhythm with the quiet anticipation inside Gate 5C at Harrison International Airport. The evening sky outside was tinted burnt orange, shadows stretching across the tarmac as boarding for Flight 228 to New York prepared to begin. Overhead, a soft announcement buzzed to life, prompting first-class passengers to gather their belongings. Gabrielle Reyes exhaled slowly, her fingers adjusting the sleeve of her deep navy blazer. She stood, graceful but tired, her posture upright despite the heavy weight of the week behind her. The heels on her boots clicked softly against the polished tile as she joined the short line near the boarding door. In one hand, she held her phone, open to an email marked Confirmed Seat 3A, First Class. In the other, a black leather carry-on that bore the scuffs and elegance of a woman who traveled often, but not aimlessly. Gabrielle was 42 years old, the founder and CEO of a rising ed tech company and the largest private shareholder in Halcyon Air. She had built everything from the ground up: the business, the reputation, the influence. Still, she never walked into a room as if anyone should already know who she was. Her deep brown skin glowed under the fluorescent airport lights, and her locks were tied neatly back into a low bun. Even after a 5-day summit in San Francisco and back-to-back investor pitches, she looked composed, calm, and measured. Her power didn't need to shout. Tonight, she was just ready to sit in 3A, stretch her legs, sip water with lemon, and close her eyes to the soft rumble of takeoff. A couple in their 20s laughed behind her, voices carrying. 2 seats up, a man in a business suit kept glancing at his Rolex. Gabrielle took a steady breath. She wasn't impatient. She was simply ready. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent. "Evening," Gabrielle offered with a polite smile. The agent barely looked up. "Hi." The badge on her uniform read Allison Park. Allison scanned the pass, then paused. Gabrielle saw it, that half-second of hesitation, the flicker of confusion that quickly slid into scrutiny. Allison frowned slightly and tapped something on her screen. "You said 3A, she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, that's what's on my confirmation." "Is there a problem?" Another quick glance at the screen. Another tap. Looks like there's been a seat change. You've been reassigned to 23C. The words dropped like ice cubes into warm water. Gabrielle blinked. "Excuse me." Allison held out a fresh boarding pass. Coach, aisle seat. Gabrielle didn't take it. I confirmed 3A 3 days ago, she said evenly. It's on my email, my app, my profile. There must be a mistake. Sometimes upgrades don't go through, Allison replied flatly. It happens. I wasn't upgraded. I paid for first. Allison gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind people used when they wanted to seem helpful, but weren't trying to be. You'll need to take this up with customer service after landing. Gabrielle's eyes didn't narrow, didn't widen. She'd mastered that stillness, the discipline of not reacting in the moment you most wanted to. Around them, the line of passengers inched forward. Someone coughed. The businessman with the Rolex cleared his throat loudly, irritated. Gabrielle stepped to the side and pulled up her confirmation email. There it was, in bold, Halcyon Air Flight 228 seat, 3A, confirmed purchased business, select fare. She turned the screen toward Allison, who barely glanced at it. I'm sorry, she said again, in that monotone register that meant the opposite. But it doesn't matter what's in your inbox. The seat's no longer available. Who reassigned it, I don't have that information. Then I'd like to speak to a supervisor. Allison let out a breath. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to say you're making this harder than it needs to be. Gabrielle noticed. She noticed everything. Years in corporate negotiations had trained her to read not just words, but posture, and Allison's was tense defensive. Still, Gabrielle stayed where she was, polite, still, not angry, not yet. Inside. Her thoughts spun, was this an error, a system glitch, or was this something else? She had been here before, not here exactly. Not this gate or this flight, but in the space where someone looked at her and made a judgment before hearing her name. Sometimes it was subtle, a double take, a delay in response, a casual, "Are you sure you belong here?" She'd hoped those days were behind her. She took a breath and stepped back, phone in hand, her thumb already moving to call her assistant. She didn't want to cause a scene. She wanted a resolution. A beat passed, then another, and deep down, Gabrielle already knew this wasn't a glitch. Gabrielle Reyes stood to the side of the boarding gate, her phone pressed lightly to her ear. The noise of the terminal pulsed around her, the rhythmic ding of gate announcements, the shuffle of rolling luggage, a child whining 2 seats away. But in her mind, everything had narrowed to a single point, that cold exchange at the counter and the boarding pass that shouldn't exist. Jordan answered on the second ring. "Hey, boss," he said, already alert. "Are you on the plane?" "Not yet," she replied calmly, though there was a tightness in her voice she couldn't hide. "Gate agent says I've been reassigned to 23C. What? Jordan's voice jumped an octave. "That's economy. I know. You had a confirmed seat. I booked it myself. I showed her the confirmation. She didn't care. There was silence on the line, followed by the sound of furious typing. Gabrielle took a seat near the window, setting her carry-on at her feet. Across from her, a couple in suits whispered to each other while eyeing her discreetly. She turned slightly away, shielding her face from view. She didn't want attention, didn't want to create spectacle. That wasn't her way. "Not yet." Jordan's voice came back through the speaker. "Okay, I just pulled your itinerary from our booking system. It's there. Gabrielle, seat 3A, confirmed, fully paid with your company card. It hasn't been changed on our end." She nodded, not because he could see it, but because she needed the confirmation for herself. Can you forward everything to my email again? Already did. I'll also reach out to Marcus in Executive Resolutions at Halcyon. He's the only one who can touch seating at that level. Thanks. Jordan, you want me to go public with this? Gabrielle hesitated. That was always the hard question. There was a time, not too long ago, when she would have said no without thinking. Her instinct was always to handle things privately, professionally, with minimal waves. She'd spent years perfecting that, learning when to hold her voice and when to use it. But lately, the world felt different. Not every slight could be swept under the rug anymore. Not yet, she said. Let's see how this plays out. She ended the call and sat still for a moment, taking in her surroundings. Passengers were boarding steadily now. One by one, names were called. First class was nearly done. The gate area was thinning out, and she was still sitting here. She could feel it, that growing tension under her skin, that cold, familiar question echoing in her head. Why her? Why now? She didn't want to believe it was about race or power or the silent calculations people make when a black woman stands in a space they didn't expect her to. But she'd lived long enough to recognize patterns. This was no mistake. Gabrielle stood and walked back to the counter, this time calmer than before. Allison was still there, eyes flicking to her screen as she scanned a new boarding pass for a man in a gray blazer. Gabrielle waited for him to pass, then stepped forward. "Has anything changed?" she asked. Allison didn't smile, didn't even pretend to soften. "No," she said. "Like I said, 3A is no longer available. I just spoke to someone in your Executive Resolutions department. They confirmed that my seat was never changed. I have the documentation, and I'd like to know who authorized the reassignment. I don't have that information. You can't see who made the change. I said I don't have it." Her voice had hardened. It wasn't just indifference anymore. It was challenge, defensiveness, the kind of tone Gabrielle had heard from managers who knew they'd crossed a line and were digging their heels in. "I'd like to speak with the supervisor," Gabrielle said again, her voice low but steady. "There is no supervisor on site at the moment," Allison replied coolly. That was a lie. Gabrielle knew it. Every gate had at least one floor manager assigned. But she didn't call it out. Instead, she took a slow breath. Then she held up her phone. "This is my confirmation email. This is my seat assignment. And this," she tapped on her screen, "is the contact number of Marcus Lee, someone very senior at your company who is currently investigating why I'm being blocked from boarding a seat I rightfully paid for." Allison's eyes flickered just for a second. A twitch at the corner of her mouth, the smallest shift in posture. "You're free to take it up with corporate," she said after a pause, then turned to scan another passenger's boarding pass. "Dismissed." Gabrielle felt something twist in her chest, a tight knot of anger that she swallowed hard against. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue further. She simply stepped aside. As she stood off to the corner again, a woman approached and touched her arm lightly. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "I couldn't help overhearing. That didn't sound right." Gabrielle looked at her, middle-aged, white, with kind eyes and a briefcase in her hand. "I'm sorry that happened," the woman added. "Do you want me to say something?" Gabrielle smiled faintly. "I appreciate it, but I'll handle it." The woman nodded and moved on. Gabrielle returned to her seat by the window. She sat down carefully, as if even gravity felt heavier than it had minutes ago. She closed her eyes, and in that moment, a memory came back years ago. Another airport, another encounter. She'd been 27, junior partner at a tech firm, flying to Dallas for a pitch. A gate agent had assumed she was an assistant, not the presenter. Asked her to move to the back. She'd said nothing then. She'd let it go. But the feeling, that cold undercurrent of being unseen, underestimated, never quite left her. Tonight, it had returned in full. Her phone buzzed. Jordan Smith. "Marcus is calling you directly. Sit tight. We're not letting this slide." Gabrielle stared at the message, then at her reflection in the window, and for the first time that evening, she let the anger surface, not loud, not uncontrolled, just enough to remind herself that silence wasn't always strength. Some things needed to be challenged, even here, even now, even at 30,000 feet. Gabrielle Reyes stood in the jet bridge alcove just beyond the boarding counter. She leaned gently against the wall, eyes closed, breath slow. A quiet resolve had settled in her chest. Not fire, not fury, but something colder and more precise. That part of her that had built an empire from scratch was now awake. She wasn't going to fight in front of an audience. She wasn't going to raise her voice, but she was going to see this through. Her phone buzzed in her hand again. A call was coming in. Marcus Lee. She accepted immediately. "Ms. Reyes," came a voice, smooth and low. "This is Marcus Lee, with executive resolutions." Jordan reached out to me. "I've just reviewed your booking profile and our back-end systems." "Go on," Gabrielle said quietly. "Your seat assignment for 3A was confirmed, fully paid. No downgrade request was initiated on our end, nor was there a voluntary reassignment. There's no customer-initiated change recorded." She let that sit for a beat. "Then why am I holding a boarding pass for 23C? "That's what we're trying to find out," Marcus said. "But there is no note, no change code, no trigger, which makes this highly unusual. Seats don't just vanish without a trace." Gabrielle's jaw tightened. "Do you have access to the agent's activity at this gate? I've submitted a request to audit the user log for this flight manifest. That'll take about 15 minutes. I'll text you as soon as I see something." She thanked him and ended the call. Then she turned and looked toward the glass where boarding continued in a slow, measured pace. The line was thinner now. First class was nearly done. Allison was still behind the counter, now chatting casually with another staff member. Gabrielle stepped toward the counter again. Allison noticed her and straightened slightly. "I'm still waiting on a supervisor," Gabrielle said, voice even. "I told you, there's no one available at the gate level right now." Gabrielle didn't blink. "I just spoke to your executive resolutions team," she said. "They confirmed my seat was never changed in the system." Allison's smile twitched. "Barely there." "Well," she said, "we must be looking at different systems." A pause. "I doubt that." Gabrielle replied. She didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, presence unwavering. Years of boardrooms and closed-door deals had taught her how to project calm power. She knew how to unsettle people without a single insult. Still, Allison didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the standoff, like this was personal now. Gabrielle turned and returned to her seat near the windows. A low ache pulsed at the back of her neck. She pressed her hand to it and closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered something her mother once told her. There will be moments when they try to shrink you. Don't argue, don't explain, just stand. She opened her eyes and sat taller, Across from her, an older black man caught her gaze. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, a silent gesture. She nodded back. Gabrielle opened her email and forwarded the full reservation file to Marcus, adding a screenshot of the physical boarding pass that said 23C. She labeled the subject line, "Evidence of unauthorized downgrade Flight 228. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Jordan. "Just got off with Halcyon HQ. Marcus escalated your case to their VP of Customer Ops. Word is traveling up the chain." She typed back quickly, "Thank you. Keep pushing. I'll stay calm." "Always do," Jordan replied. She slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and looked again toward the gate. Allison was now scanning the last of the business class passengers. Gabrielle's stomach twisted, not from fear, from that awful, rising feeling of being made to prove you belong somewhere you already earned. It wasn't the seat, it was what it represented. The idea that someone, anyone, could strip you of your dignity with a single, silent keystroke. A middle-aged white man stepped forward to board, pass in hand. He wore jeans and a faded sports coat. As Allison scanned his pass, she greeted him warmly. "Mr. Kelman, thank you for flying with us again." He smiled. "Glad to be back. Enjoy your seat in 3A. Gabrielle's breath caught. 3A. She stood before she realized she was standing. She stepped toward the line, not marching, not striding, just walking with quiet precision. She was 2 feet from the podium when Allison's eyes met hers. Gabrielle didn't speak. She didn't need to. Allison's lips parted ever so slightly, then pressed shut. She turned quickly back to the scanner. Gabrielle stopped. The ache in her chest had become something else. Not pain, not rage, clarity. 3A had been given away, not reassigned randomly, not overbooked, just handed to someone else. No record, no reason, and no apology. Gabrielle stepped back again. She didn't want a confrontation in front of strangers. She wanted accountability. Her phone buzzed. Marcus user log retrieved. The seat change was manually overridden from this gate terminal at 6:02 p.m. by Agent ID AP882. No authorization code was used. This is a violation. Gabrielle's hands trembled slightly as she read the message, but not from nerves, from restraint. Jordan texted right after, "Do you want me to loop in Lucas Bennett?" Gabrielle stared at that name for a long moment. Lucas Bennett, CEO of Halcyon Air. She had met him once, a brief, polished conversation at a corporate gala 2 years ago. He had shaken her hand, made polite small talk, praised her work in education technology. She doubted he remembered her face, but her name, that he would know. Gabrielle hesitated only a second before replying. "Not yet. Let's give them a chance to do the right thing first." She sat back down and crossed her legs, watching as the last of the pre-boarding passengers trickled through. The boarding doors would close soon. She wasn't on the plane, and her rightful seat was occupied by someone else. Still, Gabrielle didn't leave. She waited, composed, grounded, because she wasn't just protecting her own dignity. She was drawing a line for everyone who'd ever been quietly removed, brushed aside, treated like a mistake in a place they belonged. Inside Halcyon Air's Houston Operations Center, Marcus Lee rubbed the bridge of his nose and stared at his screen. A log report blinked softly on the second monitor. The seat change audit for Flight 228 laid bare in digital clarity. Agent AP882 had manually reassigned Seat 3A to another passenger without reason, without authorization, and without any code to justify it, it was the sort of thing that should never happen. And yet, here it was, time-stamped and confirmed. He looked over at Tasha, the analyst 2 desks down, who had helped him pull the back-end data. "Can you double-check this for me?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. Tasha leaned over and scrolled through the flight manifest log. "Yeah, that's clean. The reassignment wasn't requested by the customer, wasn't system-generated, and it wasn't flagged as an operational swap. That agent did it herself. No remarks entered." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Gabrielle Reyes wasn't just a first-class passenger. She was the largest private stakeholder in Halcyon Air. Her name wasn't on any promotional materials. She didn't sit on the board. But she had influence, deep and lasting, built from years of careful investment. He picked up his phone and texted Jordan Smith again. Passenger 3A was reassigned by gate agent with no authorization. "Working on next steps. Gabrielle has full grounds to escalate," Jordan replied in seconds. "She's holding steady. But this is getting uglier. I have the full reservation trail if you need it for executive leadership." Marcus already knew it. This was going to go up the chain, fast. Still, part of him hoped they could resolve it internally before it hit the headlines. He toggled to the employee roster and pulled up Allison Park's profile. 8 years with the company. No major disciplinary records, but a handful of minor flags, 2 complaints in the last year, both related to tone and conduct at boarding gates. Nothing ever escalated beyond mediation. He leaned back in his chair. Until now. Meanwhile, back at Gate 5C, Gabrielle sat quietly as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. She checked her watch. They were almost at cutoff. A few last stragglers rushed past, calling out their row numbers. Allison stood at her post, scanning tickets without making eye contact. Gabrielle's phone buzzed again. "Marcus, I've escalated this to corporate oversight. Waiting to hear from leadership. Sit tight. You're not wrong to stand your ground." Gabrielle didn't reply immediately. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She didn't want to seem impatient, but her patience wasn't limitless. She looked back at the gate, then to the jet bridge beyond, where the plane door stood open, the faint hum of cabin air systems drifting out like a whisper. She should be on that plane. She should be in her seat. She thought again about the man, Mr. Kelman, who now occupied her space. What had he thought when the agent handed him that pass? Did he know it had been taken from someone else, or had he simply accepted it with gratitude? Assuming it was a lucky break, Gabrielle wanted to believe he hadn't known, that he wasn't complicit, that this wasn't personal from him. But the system that had enabled it, that had quietly nudged her out of her rightful place without question, that was personal. Every time it happened to someone like her, it was personal. She thought of her niece, Amara, a freshman at Howard University who had called her last month crying after being told she couldn't possibly be the lead on her engineering project. "They just assumed I was helping the white guy," she'd said, voice trembling, like I couldn't be the one in charge. Gabrielle had comforted her that night, speaking softly through the phone, letting her niece's pain melt into the quiet strength of her voice. But deep down, she remembered that same pain, that same disbelief, that same fire. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize, but she knew exactly who it was. She answered. "Ms. Reyes." "Yes." "This is Sylvia Carr, Director of Customer Operations for Halcyon. I've just been briefed on your situation. Gabrielle said nothing at first. She waited. I want to begin by sincerely apologizing. Sylvia continued. We've reviewed the seat logs and it's clear there was an unauthorized reassignment. That should never happen. I've instructed our gate supervisor to meet you at the counter immediately. We will correct this before departure. Gabrielle spoke calmly. I appreciate your call, but I want to be clear. This wasn't a simple oversight. The gate agent made this decision intentionally, without reason, and she didn't just move my seat. She refused to acknowledge the problem when I pointed it out. There was a pause. I understand, Sylvia said, and I'm not minimizing that. We're taking this seriously. There will be a formal review of the agent's conduct. In the meantime, your seat is being reinstated. If you proceed to the counter, you'll be able to board immediately. Gabrielle exhaled, not a sigh of relief, more like a quiet release of breath held too long. Thank you, she said. She stood and gathered her bag. Every eye in the gate seemed to follow her now. She walked toward the counter with measured steps, not hurried, not hesitant. When she arrived, a second agent had joined Allison, a supervisor, tall and quiet, with a neutral expression and silver hair. He turned to Gabrielle. Ms. Reyes. Yes. Your original seat has been restored. Please allow me to escort you on board. He gestured toward the boarding pass scanner. Allison didn't say a word. Her posture stiffened as Gabrielle passed. Their eyes met for the briefest second. Gabrielle didn't glare. She didn't gloat. She simply looked, not through her, at her, as if to say, I'm still here. She stepped onto the jet bridge. The sound of her boots muted against the rubber floor. As she approached the cabin door, she straightened her shoulders. She had not raised her voice. She had not made a scene. And yet, here she was, boarding in her rightful place, with her dignity intact. It was a quiet kind of power, the kind that didn't always announce itself, the kind that didn't need to. The cabin was already humming when Gabrielle Reyes stepped through the threshold of the aircraft. A soft, instrumental track played over the speakers, and the lights were dimmed to a welcome and amber glow. Passengers were still stowing bags overhead and adjusting jackets. Business travelers tapped quickly on tablets. One woman was already reclined with a glass of champagne. Gabrielle walked calmly past row 1, row 2, and there it was, 3A. Her seat. She paused beside it, set down her bag gently, and let her fingertips graze the leather armrest. It was ridiculous, she thought, how something as simple as a seat assignment could carry so much weight. But this wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about legroom. It was about being told subtly, sharply, deliberately that you didn't belong. She slid into the seat and exhaled. A flight attendant with kind eyes and auburn curls approached, her voice quiet. Welcome aboard, Ms. Reyes. Can I get you anything to start just water? No lemon? Absolutely. Gabrielle nodded. She was starting to relax when she heard the tap of hurried footsteps on the jet bridge, then the low murmur of tense voices at the front of the plane. The captain had stepped out of the cockpit. Gabrielle recognized her by the silver stripes and the confident stillness of someone used to high-stakes decision-making. She spoke quietly to the lead flight attendant, who leaned in and whispered something back. Gabrielle's chest tightened. Not again. Seconds later, a uniformed security officer appeared at the aircraft door. Tall, stern-faced. A second figure followed shorter, younger, female, hand on her radio. The captain turned to block their path but didn't raise her voice. Gabrielle sat very still. The plane was watching now. The hum of casual conversation had quieted. She felt the shift in energy ripple through the first-class cabin like static. She pulled her phone from her bag, unlocked it with a swipe, and hovered her thumb over the call button for Jordan. Please, not this. The taller officer stepped into the cabin and looked directly at her. Ma'am, can I ask you to step off the plane with us for a moment? Every muscle in her body tightened. She didn't move. I'm Gabrielle Reyes, she said, calm but firm. This is my confirmed seat. Your director of customer operations just reinstated it. I'm in contact with Marcus Lee from Executive Resolutions, and I'm not leaving. The officer blinked, hesitated. The younger one spoke, voice clipped. We've received a report from the gate that a passenger boarded using an invalid seat assignment. We're just following up. Gabrielle slowly raised her phone, holding it toward them. I have confirmation of my seat from your corporate team. You're welcome to verify it, but I will not be removed. Behind her, passengers were watching silently. A woman across the aisle stared wide-eyed. A man 2 rows back folded his arms and looked away, as if disengaging absolved him of complicity. The captain stepped between them. She's right, she said plainly. We've verified everything. This is her seat. She has a valid boarding pass and a corporate-level reinstatement. Gabrielle met the captain's eyes. She didn't smile, but there was a mutual understanding there. Recognition. The security officers exchanged glances. The taller one softened. Understood. Apologies, ma'am. He turned and walked back toward the door. The younger one hesitated a beat longer, then followed. Gabrielle's heart was still pounding. Her hands were steady, but her chest burned with humiliation. She had been seconds away from being removed. Again. The flight attendant returned with her water. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it down. She leaned in, voice gentle. I'm so sorry, Ms. Reyes. I saw what happened at the gate. It wasn't right. Gabrielle nodded once, her throat tight. Thank you. The captain lingered by the cockpit. She looked over once more, then disappeared behind the door. The cabin buzz returned gradually. People resumed what they had been doing, reading, sipping, scrolling, but Gabrielle felt raw, like the skin over her composure had been scraped too thin. She opened her phone and texted Jordan. Security was just called to remove me from the flight. Captain intervened. His reply came instantly. What, they're escalating it. Keep every receipt. Already have. Gabrielle stared out the window as the jet bridge pulled away. They had tried, even after the seat was restored, even after corporate confirmed. Someone at that gate couldn't stand to see her sitting in 3A, not because she didn't belong, but because someone didn't want her to. The doors sealed, the aircraft pushed back slowly from the gate, and Gabrielle sat motionless, a storm building quietly in her chest. It was no longer about the seat. It was about power, and what people did when they thought you had none. The aircraft rumbled beneath Gabrielle's feet as the engines powered up for taxi. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft golden hue across the faces of the first-class passengers. The sound of wheels turning on the tarmac blended with the faint clinking of glasses, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional cough from somewhere in coach. Gabrielle sat still. Her body settled into 3A, but her mind was anything but. She sipped the cold water resting in the tray beside her, the condensation dripping onto a napkin she hadn't touched. Her gaze was fixed out the window, watching as the ground crew waved them toward the runway. She wasn't relaxed. Not yet. Everything about this flight felt like a test she hadn't agreed to take. She could still feel it how close she had come to being pulled off the plane, like some unruly passenger causing trouble. If the captain hadn't stepped in, if the security officer had been just a little less hesitant, she would have been escorted back into the terminal, while the person who stole her seat reclined comfortably at 30,000 feet. Her phone buzzed again. She checked it quickly before switching to airplane mode. "Jordan, I've looped Marcus in on the security incident. He's furious. Says this goes way beyond protocol. Do you want me to bring in Lucas?" Gabrielle stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered for a second. "Not yet," she typed. "I want to get through this flight first." She powered the phone off, then placed it in the seat pocket. Her fingers brushed against the in-flight magazine. She pulled it out just to give her hand something to do, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She thought of all the people watching her as security approached. The way some passengers looked away, embarrassed maybe, or unsure of what to think. Others had stared outright, as if waiting for her to prove their worst assumptions. She remembered the man who had taken her seat, Mr. Kelman. He hadn't said a word, hadn't offered to move, hadn't asked any questions. He had simply sat down and let the gate agent's decision work in his favor. That, more than anything, left a sour taste in her mouth. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, clear, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 228 nonstop service to New York. We're currently number 4 for takeoff. Expected time in the air is 2 hours and 23 minutes. Weather's clear over most of the flight path. We'll be cruising at 36,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Gabrielle felt something in her loosen at the sound of that voice. The captain hadn't hesitated. She had intervened when it mattered. As the plane lifted off the runway, she let herself sink a little deeper into the seat. The city lights below blurred into gold threads, slowly swallowed by the dark sky. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin with towels and menus. Gabrielle politely declined both. She didn't feel like eating. Her appetite had disappeared hours ago, somewhere between her original boarding pass and the new one she never asked for. About 30 minutes into the flight, after the initial service wrapped up, the lead flight attendant approached Gabrielle's seat. This wasn't the same young woman who had greeted her earlier. This one was older, composed, with kind eyes and a sharpness behind them that suggested she'd seen everything there was to see on a plane. "Ms. Reyes," she said gently, "Captain Hayes asked me to check in with you. She wanted to make sure you're all right." Gabrielle looked up, momentarily caught off guard. "That's very kind," she replied. "I'm fine now. Just processing." The flight attendant nodded, lowering her voice just enough to give the moment privacy. "She told me what happened. Said she reviewed your documentation personally, that she didn't appreciate how the gate handled things." Gabrielle nodded slowly. "Neither did I." The attendant hesitated. "You should know. A few of us saw it too. The crew at the gate, the exchange. We don't get to say much in those moments, but it didn't sit right with us either." Gabrielle exhaled, grateful for the acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said. "I've been flying for a long time. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but it's the first time I pushed back." The woman gave a faint, respectful smile. "Well, you weren't wrong to—" She placed a warm towel on Gabrielle's tray anyway, just in case, then turned to continue her rounds. Gabrielle sat still, her eyes trained on the space in front of her. Her mind wandered, drifting through the weight of the day. Her thoughts began to drift to her father. He'd been a pilot in the Air Force, quiet, meticulous, firm but kind. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager while he folded the morning paper, his words clipped with military precision. They don't need to like you, Gabrielle, but they're going to respect you. And when they don't, when they pretend you don't belong, you make sure your presence is undeniable. She had carried that lesson into boardrooms, onto stages, into investor meetings, and now here into the narrow but symbolic row of first class. She pressed her hands together in her lap, grounding herself. Her thoughts were interrupted again by a soft knock on the bulkhead wall. Captain Hayes stood at the front of the cabin, out of uniform now, in a charcoal sweater and slacks, but still carrying that unmistakable presence. She approached Gabrielle's row. "May I sit?" Gabrielle gestured to the empty seat beside her. The captain took it, folding her hands on her knees. "I wanted to speak with you directly," she began. "What happened tonight was unacceptable. You were treated in a way no passenger should ever be treated, let alone someone who had done everything right." Gabrielle tilted her head. "Thank you for stepping in. I know that probably wasn't easy." The captain gave a half smile. "Easy doesn't always matter. Right does." They sat for a few moments in a comfortable silence. Then Captain Hayes continued, "You don't owe me your story, but if there's anything else I can do, or help elevate, I want to make sure this doesn't disappear." Gabrielle looked at her thoughtfully. "I appreciate that. I've already spoken with corporate, and I have people on the ground handling the rest." She paused. "But what I want is for this to mean something. I'm not just some upset customer. I'm invested in this airline's success, financially, strategically, ethically." The captain straightened slightly. "You're a stakeholder." Gabrielle met her eyes. "I'm your largest private investor." Captain Hayes absorbed that. Her face didn't show surprise, just a deeper awareness. "Then, I guess this airline just tried to erase the wrong woman." Gabrielle didn't laugh, but her eyes softened. "I guess so." The captain stood. "Thank you for your grace and your patience. I'll be filing a report myself." She extended a hand. Gabrielle shook it, and for the first time all evening, something inside her felt solid again. She wasn't alone. She wasn't small, and this fight, this story, was only just beginning. The soft hum of the engines had become almost meditative as the plane cruised over the Midwest. Gabrielle Reyes sat quietly in seat 3A, her shoulders slightly relaxed, though not entirely at ease. Her conversation with Captain Hayes had grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time in hours, she wasn't navigating alone. She pulled the wool blanket higher over her lap and leaned her head against the headrest, eyes drifting closed for a moment. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, pinpricks of starlight dotting the darkness. Below them, the world was quiet, but inside her mind, thoughts churned like a current just beneath still water. Would this flight be the last time she let something like this slide beneath the surface? Or was this the moment it had to go public? She wasn't sure yet, but she was closer to knowing. A faint rustling sound brought her eyes open again. A different flight attendant. A tall man in his early 30s with a name tag that read Jason stood beside her seat. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Excuse me, Ms. Reyes," he said quietly. "A passenger and coach asked me to give you this." In his hand was a folded piece of paper. Gabrielle blinked. A passenger. He nodded, didn't say who. She hesitated, then took the paper from his hand. It felt warm, like it had been held tightly for a while. Jason gave her a brief, almost apologetic smile, then turned and walked briskly back toward the rear of the plane. Gabrielle looked down at the paper in her hands. It was plain white, folded precisely once. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she opened it. The message was short. "You may have won this time, but people like you don't belong in seats like that. Watch your back." Her stomach dropped. The words were written in sharp, jagged script, as if carved with frustration. The handwriting looked rushed, slightly slanted to the right, but it was legible, purposeful. She stared at it for a long moment, reading it once, then twice. A chill crept down her spine. She folded the note again and set it face down on the tray table. The cabin was still. No one seemed to be watching her. The other passengers in first class were reading, dozing, scrolling on their phones. She scanned the rows, eyes sweeping carefully. No one looked suspicious, no one looked out of place, but someone had sent that note. Someone behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane had taken the time to write those words and ask a flight attendant to deliver them. That meant someone had been watching her, listening, perhaps even enjoying the conflict at the gate and upset by the fact that she had won. She pressed the call button. Within seconds, the same older flight attendant from earlier appeared at her side. Her warm demeanor turned serious the moment she saw Gabrielle's face. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Gabrielle didn't speak right away. She handed her the folded note without a word. The woman opened it, eyes scanning quickly. Her jaw tightened. "Who gave this to you, Jason?" Gabrielle said softly. "He said a coach passenger asked him to deliver it." The flight attendant looked over her shoulder as if she could somehow see through the cabin wall. "I'll show this to the captain," she said. "Please stay here. We'll handle it." Gabrielle nodded, though her hands were cold. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but she felt exposed, threatened. It wasn't just a passive-aggressive move like the seat reassignment. This was deliberate, personal. She had no way of knowing if the person who wrote it was seated 10 rows behind her or directly behind the curtain. 10 minutes passed before the flight attendant returned, this time with Captain Hayes trailing behind her. The captain wore a calm but focused expression. "Ms. Reyes," she said gently, kneeling beside her seat so they could speak at eye level. "I've read the note. First, I want to say how sorry I am that this has happened on my flight. This is entirely unacceptable." Gabrielle's voice was steady, but low. "Do you know who sent it?" "Not yet," Captain Hayes replied. "There's no camera footage on board, and we can't demand a handwriting sample mid-flight. I've spoken to Jason. He said he received it from a man in row 19, but didn't get a name." Gabrielle's expression didn't change. "Do you believe him?" "I believe he was caught off guard, but we're speaking with him further after landing. I've already sent a message to the destination crew. When we land, security will meet the plane and speak to everyone involved." Gabrielle nodded slowly. "I'd prefer this be handled quietly," she said, "but I also want it handled thoroughly." "Understood." The captain stood. "I'm increasing cabin crew patrol through the aisles, and if at any point you feel uncomfortable, call the crew immediately. We're taking this seriously." Gabrielle looked down at the folded note again, then back up at the captain. I've flown with this airline for years. I've invested in it, believed in it, and now I'm getting notes like this 30,000 feet in the air. Captain Hayes didn't flinch, but she didn't look away either. You shouldn't have to carry that, and you won't carry it alone. She turned and returned to the cockpit, the flight attendant quietly following. Gabrielle sat back in her seat, her eyes now trained not on the window but on the closed curtain to coach. Behind that curtain sat the person who had written those words, who had felt entitled to say she didn't belong. Maybe they were emboldened by what happened at the gate. Maybe they believed she had gamed the system, or maybe it was just pure, cold bias. It didn't matter, because no matter who they were, no matter what they believed, she was still here, still in her seat, still Gabrielle Reyes, still the woman who had built her business from nothing, who had sat in boardrooms where people doubted her and left those same rooms with contracts signed and power in her hands. She looked at the note again, her fingers curling over the edge. She didn't tear it, she didn't crumble it, she tucked it into her notebook, a record, a reminder. This wasn't over, not yet. The curtain between first class and coach fluttered gently with the airflow from the cabin vents. It was just fabric, just stitched polyester and nylon. But in Gabrielle's mind, it might as well have been a wall, an invisible line drawn not by money, but by power, perception, and something far older than airline status tiers. She sat with her arms folded lightly, the cabin blanketed in soft silence, overhead lights dimmed, tray tables stowed, screens flickering with muted news reports and rom-coms. The engines roared softly beneath it all, steady and constant. But her thoughts were anything but calm. The note still rested in her notebook, folded and hidden away. Her mind replayed the sentence again and again. Not the words exactly, but the feeling behind them. That cold, familiar sting of being told even without direct confrontation that you were unwanted in a space you had earned. It reminded her of a moment long ago. She had been 16. Her high school counselor had pulled her aside after she received her PSAT scores. They were exceptional, higher than most seniors. She remembered the woman's face, pleasant, polite, but patronizing. "This is impressive," the counselor had said, "but maybe you should consider something more practical, something like community college, just to be safe." Gabrielle had nodded back then, because arguing felt risky. But that night she went home, wrote a list of 10 universities, and pinned it to her bedroom wall. A year later, she went to Princeton on a full scholarship. But no list could prepare her for the quiet, everyday undermining that followed her from campus, to internships, to the boardroom, to seat 3A. The hum of the airplane was broken by a voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a pocket of light turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seat belts fastened." The plane trembled slightly as if punctuating the captain's warning. It wasn't dramatic, just a gentle, prolonged shiver, but it pulled Gabrielle out of her memory. Her fingers instinctively reached for the armrests. Steadying herself, across the aisle, a man gripped his drink. Someone behind her groaned. The familiar ripple of anxiety passed through the cabin like static, but Gabrielle wasn't afraid of turbulence. She had always understood it, in a way, a force of nature that reminded people they weren't entirely in control. This she could handle. What rattled her wasn't the shaking of metal in the sky. It was the knowledge that someone a few rows away had taken the time to craft a threat while she sat unaware. That required intention. That required gall. And that meant this wasn't just a moment. It was something deeper. The older flight attendant returned with a small note from the captain. Gabrielle unfolded it quietly. "Security will meet us at the gate. You are safe. We are watching." She tucked it away. She didn't want to live her life always needing to be watched over. She wanted to move through the world without constant vigilance. But she was also smart enough to accept support when it was offered. She took a slow breath, then reached for the small journal she always kept in her carry-on. It was cloth-bound, navy blue, the cover fraying just slightly at the corners. She opened it to a clean page and began to write. Not because she planned to share it with anyone. Not yet. But because writing grounded her. It turned chaos into clarity. July 17th, 8:54 p.m. Somewhere above Indiana. I'm writing this mid-flight because I need to remember how this feels. Not just the threat, but the restraint. The fire sitting in my chest, waiting to become something useful. Today, I was told again that I don't belong. Not directly, but in ways that people think they can explain away. A reassigned seat, a cold tone, a handwritten note slid under the radar. But I'm still here. I'm not going to erupt. That's what they want. I'm going to outlast, outthink, outwork. And when this is over, I will hold them accountable. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been humiliated in silence and forced to accept it. She paused, tapped the pen against the edge of the tray table, then underlined the words still here. The plane rocked again, slightly stronger this time. Someone gasped from coach. A few heads turned. The pilot came back over the speaker. "Apologies, folks. That was a bit bumpier than expected. We should be out of it in about 10 minutes. Gabrielle set her journal down and looked around. The man in seat 3C beside her was dozing, unaware of the storm playing out just a few feet from him. The curtain to coach remained closed, still and silent. She wondered, not for the first time, who had written the note. Was it a man? A woman? Someone who thought she'd taken a seat they deserved. Someone who couldn't stand the idea of a black woman sitting in first class without needing to explain why she was there. It didn't matter anymore. Whoever they were, they had underestimated her. Jason passed by again with the drink cart. Gabrielle watched him, but he avoided her eyes. His movements were stiff, rehearsed. He offered drinks to other passengers with a flatness that made her wonder if he regretted being involved at all, or if he simply didn't want to be. The older flight attendant followed shortly after. "Ms. Reyes, can I offer you anything?" she asked gently. Gabrielle looked up at her and shook her head. "Just thank you," she said. The woman gave a small nod. "No thanks needed. We see more than people think." She lingered for a moment, then moved on. Gabrielle sat back, her body steady even as the aircraft swayed. She had learned a long time ago that storms didn't always come with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they came quietly, in policy, in tone, in silence. But this time, she wasn't going to let it pass. She would land. She would speak. And something would change. The wheels touched down with a subtle jolt, and Gabrielle Reyes felt the familiar sensation of deceleration push her gently into the seat back. For a moment, all she could hear was the roar of the engines reversing. Then came the soft whine of the brakes and the announcement from Captain Hayes. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Local time is 9:37 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop at the gate. On behalf of our crew, We thank you for flying with us." Polite applause followed, scattered and half-hearted. Gabrielle didn't join. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, eyes staring ahead at the bulkhead. The flight might have landed, but the weight of the journey still pressed against her chest. Passengers in the back stirred with urgency. Overhead, bins clicked open, jackets shuffled, cell phones lit up as people switched off airplane mode and returned to their worlds. Gabrielle's world was just beginning to shift. The curtain to first class opened slightly as the senior flight attendant stepped forward, her voice low and deliberate. "Ms. Reyes, if you'd prefer to disembark separately, we've arranged for that. Security and corporate staff are waiting just beyond the jet bridge." Gabrielle nodded. "Let the others go first," she said. "I'm not walking out like a spectacle." The flight attendant inclined her head in quiet agreement and turned to manage the front rows. One by one, the passengers in first class collected their bags and filtered out. A few glanced at Gabrielle with veiled curiosity. One woman in 2B gave a sympathetic smile. Gabrielle returned a polite nod. Once the cabin had mostly cleared, Gabrielle stood, pulled her leather tote from the overhead bin, and rolled her carry-on behind her with precise grace. Her blazer was still neatly pressed. Her heels clicked softly against the aisle carpet as she stepped toward the exit. Captain Hayes stood at the door, arms folded, her face steady. "Thank you again for your patience. Ms. Reyes," she said, "I've sent a copy of the report to executive. You won't be alone in this." Gabrielle met her eyes. "I believe you," she said. "Let's make sure they believe it too." She stepped off the plane. A wall of fluorescent light greeted her in the jet bridge, and standing in that narrow corridor were two men in navy suits and a woman in an airport security vest. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, early 40s, with neatly parted hair and sharp features. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "I'm Darren Mendez from the Airline's Risk and Legal Team. This is Riva Ortiz from Port Authority Security." Gabrielle stopped just a few steps past the plane door. "You received the captain's incident report?" she asked. "We did," Darren replied. "We're here to escort you to a private area to debrief. There's also someone from the corporate office arriving shortly." Gabrielle didn't respond. She simply gestured for them to lead the way. They walked in silence down a restricted corridor, bypassing baggage claim and the terminal bustle. After a short elevator ride and a brief walk past tinted windows, Gabrielle was led into a quiet conference room just off the executive offices. Neutral walls, a polished wood table, bottled water already placed on a tray. She didn't sit immediately. She paced once around the room, letting her mind settle, then finally pulled out the same notebook from earlier and placed it on the table. Riva Ortiz spoke first. "We've reviewed Jason's statements. He claims he was handed the note by a man in row 19, dark jacket, no name, no incident was reported after. But we will review arrival footage, security cameras in the terminal, and continue an internal investigation." Gabrielle nodded. "I understand the limitations, but you also understand the larger context here." Darren opened his tablet. "I do. I've been briefed. You're an equity stakeholder." "I'm more than that," she said calmly. "I've served on the advisory board for your loyalty division. I've sat in quarterly shareholder meetings. I've mentored 2 of your current VPs." There was no arrogance in her tone, only precision. And in spite of all that, she continued, "I was removed from my assigned seat, issued a downgrade without explanation, forced to fight through 3 layers of customer service, called a problem by a gate agent, nearly removed by security mid-boarding, and then threatened in writing while in the air. She let the words settle like slow thunder. "And if that's what happens to me," she said finally, "what happens to the people who don't have my name or my network?" Darren looked visibly uncomfortable. Riva remained still. "We take this very seriously," he said. "I need more than promises." Gabrielle replied, "I want accountability, and I want systemic change." Before either of them could speak again, the door opened. A woman entered, striking in her quiet authority. Salt and pepper hair pulled into a bun, crisp navy pantsuit, gold watch. No visible ID badge, but a presence that made it unnecessary. She crossed the room with purpose and extended a hand. "Ms. Reyes, I'm Evelyn Locke, Chief Operating Officer of Skylux." Gabrielle stood slowly and shook her hand. Evelyn turned to Darren and Riva. "Would you both give us the room?" They complied quickly. Once they were gone, Evelyn sat across from Gabrielle and studied her for a moment. "I read the report," she began. "I watched the footage from the gate. I saw the live transcript of the call between your assistant and Marcus Lee. I've also reviewed your history with us. You've been one of our strongest advocates, and tonight we failed you in almost every way that matters." Gabrielle remained quiet. "More importantly," Evelyn continued, "we exposed something larger, a culture issue, a failure of training, a blind spot in how we treat passengers who don't match a certain expectation of belonging in the front cabin." Still, Gabrielle waited. She had heard apologies before. "We are placing Allison Park, the gate agent, on immediate administrative leave," Evelyn said plainly. "Jason, the flight attendant who delivered the note without alerting the crew, will be reassigned pending internal review. And we are launching a third-party audit into all reported incidents involving seat downgrades and racial bias on our domestic routes in the last 24 months. Gabrielle finally spoke. "That's a start, but I want to see the data, and I want a say in what happens next." "You'll have both," Evelyn replied. They sat in silence for a moment, 2 women who had climbed similar ladders in different worlds. "I don't just want justice for tonight," Gabrielle said softly. "I want to help build something better." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Then let's build it." The following morning, Gabrielle Reyes stood before a full-length mirror in her Manhattan hotel suite, straightening the cuffs of her ivory blouse. She wore no blazer today, no statement jewelry. Her appearance was intentional, understated, but unmistakably commanding. She had slept less than 4 hours. Her assistant, Jordan, had booked a private conference suite just a few blocks from Skylux's East Coast headquarters. And now, Gabrielle would sit across from a group of executives, some of whom she'd helped appoint, while addressing a culture they had all allowed to fester in silence. Her phone buzzed once. "Jordan room's ready. Evelyn's team is assembling." Gabrielle took a slow breath. She looked into her own eyes in the mirror. This wasn't about retaliation. This was about reckoning. 30 minutes later, she entered the sleek glass building on East 47th and passed through security with her carry-on in tow. The front desk associate didn't ask her name. They already knew. A Skylux staffer escorted her to the elevator, then to a quiet hallway lined with framed photos of the company's founders and retired aircraft models. Gabrielle noticed them all, 3 rows of silver-haired white men in suits, A few women sprinkled here and there, but not a single face that looked like hers. She stepped into the boardroom. Evelyn Locke was already seated at the head of the long walnut table. Beside her sat the general counsel, the head of people and culture, and 2 board observers. No cameras, no media, just polished water bottles and a stack of printed incident reports. "Gabrielle," Evelyn said warmly, "thank you for coming." Gabrielle took her seat across from them, setting her leather notebook on the table without opening it. "Let's skip the pleasantries," she said calmly. "You know why I'm here." Everyone fell silent. Evelyn nodded once. "We've reviewed the final findings from the internal audit, and we've made the decision to invite a public oversight panel to review our training, our escalation protocols, and our disciplinary systems." Gabrielle looked to the head of people, and in the last 12 months she asked, "How many complaints related to discriminatory seat downgrades were filed?" The woman cleared her throat. 47 formal grievances, 17 involving black passengers, 10 involving gate agent overrides. Gabrielle leaned back. "And how many of those were escalated to corporate silence?" The general counsel spoke up. "Only 5. 2 led to compensation. None led to termination." Gabrielle exhaled, which tells me that the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as designed to contain liability, not correct harm. Evelyn didn't argue. She just nodded again. "That's why we want to invite you to co-lead a new initiative," she said, "with independent authority. We're calling it Open Skies." Gabrielle raised an eyebrow. "And what does Open Skies actually do?" "It investigates, it monitors, it recommends enforcement, with full access to flight records, passenger complaints, and staffing decisions, and you would appoint the leadership team." The offer hung in the air. Gabrielle opened her notebook. She slid a document across the table. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a draft framework titled "Dignity in Transit, a Structural Review of Bias in Airline Operations." "I've already started outlining a broader framework," she said. "It includes gate training reform, AI analysis of pattern complaints, first-class seat and algorithm audits, and a passenger bill of rights with teeth." Evelyn skimmed the document, eyes narrowing with cautious respect. "You've been thinking about this for a while." Gabrielle's voice was soft but resolute. "I've lived it for a while." Another silence. The general counsel spoke again. "Would you be willing to help us pilot this with Skylux exclusively before we propose it?" Industry-wide, Gabrielle didn't respond immediately. She let the weight of the moment settle. Then she nodded. "On one condition." Everyone looked up. "When we go public with this," she said, "I speak first. I share the story, the full story, no sugarcoating, no brand spin, just truth." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You have my word." Gabrielle rose to her feet. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. The power wasn't in the volume. It was in the clarity. As she left the room, Jordan was waiting just outside, phone in hand. "You good?" he asked. "I'm better than good," she replied. Back in the car. She finally allowed herself a long breath. She scrolled through her emails, messages from former colleagues, supportive notes from 2 reporters who had heard whispers, an inquiry from a civil rights nonprofit asking for a quote. Her thumb hovered over the reply button. Not yet. Not until the moment was right. She stared out the window, watching the city glide past. All her life, she had been taught that restraint was survival, that silence was safer, that invisibility was a form of protection, but she'd learned something else too. Visibility could be power, and this time she wasn't going to disappear into gratitude or professionalism or quiet endurance. She was going to lead, with dignity, with fire, with truth, and the skies would never be the same. The press conference was set for a Thursday morning in Lower Manhattan. A large, neutral stage, black velvet drapes, and rows of folding chairs for media outlets filled the Skylux Events Pavilion. It was the same venue where new fleet unveilings and profit briefings were typically held. But this time, no one was talking about new planes or quarterly earnings. This time, they were here to listen. Gabrielle Reyes stood behind the curtain, steadying her breath. Jordan adjusted the small mic clipped discreetly to her collar. Outside, the buzz of press crews and camera shutters filled the air like static before a thunderstorm. Headlines had already begun to swirl in the days leading up to the announcement. Thanks to a leaked memo from inside Skylux, what had happened to Gabrielle on Flight 228 was no longer just a private humiliation. It had become a national reckoning. Jordan looked her over one last time. "You're good," he said softly. Gabrielle didn't smile, but she nodded. This wasn't about charisma. This was about clarity. A staff member opened the curtain, and she stepped into the light. The flashbulbs began immediately, flickering like heat lightning. Gabrielle moved to the podium, her heels quiet on the carpeted stage. She wore a deep blue blouse, pressed slacks, and a single gold pin at her collar, a subtle nod to the Horizon logo from Skylux's earliest branding. She wasn't there as an executive or a victim. She was there as herself. The room quieted as she adjusted the microphone. She looked out over the crowd. Journalists from national networks, independent bloggers, airline employees in uniform, even 2 passengers from her flight. She met their eyes briefly, then began to speak. "My name is Gabrielle Reyes. I'm a longtime investor, an advisor, and a frequent flyer with Skylux Airlines. Some of you may know my story already, but I'm not here to tell you just what happened to me. I'm here to tell you why it matters." Her voice was soft, but unshaken. "On July 16th, I boarded Flight 228 from Chicago to New York. I had reserved a first-class seat, as I often do, but when I arrived at the gate, I was informed that my seat had been reassigned. No explanation, no apology, just a printed boarding pass for coach and a cold smile. Several reporters began typing rapidly. I asked why. I was told there were no available seats left in the front cabin. I later found out that my original seat had been given to a white passenger who arrived late and carried no elite status. When I calmly requested my assigned seat back, I was labeled disruptive. A supervisor was called, then security, and I was nearly removed from the plane altogether. She paused, but I wasn't, because I stayed calm, because I asked the right questions, and because I knew what most passengers don't, that I had every right to be where I was. She reached slowly into her folder and held up a copy of her original boarding pass. I am not the only person this has happened to. I am simply one who has the privilege and the platform to speak up. She set the pass down and looked directly at the audience. I was told I didn't belong, not in words, but in actions, in tone, in omission. I was told that my presence was a mistake, an error to be corrected. And after the flight took off, I received a threatening note from a fellow passenger. A note that said, "People like you don't belong in seats like that." Gasps rippled across the room. Gabrielle let the silence settle. But I am here to say this clearly, not just for me, but for everyone who's been quietly downgraded, dismissed, or disrespected in spaces they earned the right to occupy. She leaned slightly forward. We do belong. A few members of the audience applauded. She waited until it faded. In response to what happened, I was approached by the leadership of Skylux. They listened, and, more importantly, they acted. She clicked the small remote in her hand, and a large screen behind her lit up with the new initiative's logo. Dignity in Transit. The Open Skies Initiative. The Open Skies Initiative will conduct independent audits, enforce accountability, and ensure that every passenger, regardless of race, gender, or economic background, is treated with fairness and respect. I will be co-chairing this effort with a team of civil rights leaders, data scientists, and policy advisors. This isn't a bandage, it's a blueprint. The room broke into soft murmurs. And yes, the employees responsible for the mistreatment I faced have been held accountable. But this isn't about punishing individuals. It's about transforming a system that too often gives the benefit of the doubt to some and suspicion to others. She looked again at the crowd. Her voice dropped to a more intimate tone. You shouldn't have to explain why you deserve dignity. You shouldn't have to list your credentials to justify being treated decently. You shouldn't have to smile through humiliation to prove you're not a threat. A hush fell again. I'm not here today because I want attention. I'm here because silence is what allows harm to multiply. The screen behind her faded to black. I was denied my seat, but I did not lose my voice. And now, I intend to use it for everyone still being quietly told they're out of place. With that, she stepped back from the podium. Applause filled the room, not raucous, but rising layered with admiration, with recognition, with resolve. As she exited the stage, Jordan handed her a water bottle and whispered, "You just made history." Gabrielle gave a quiet nod. "No," she said, "we just started fixing it. Backstage." Evelyn Locke was waiting. She extended a hand, but Gabrielle embraced her instead. It was brief, professional, but real. "You honored your word," Gabrielle said, "and you changed the narrative." Evelyn replied. Outside the building, a small crowd had gathered, former airline employees, travelers, college students holding signs that read, "We do belong and let us fly." Gabrielle paused at the entrance, taking in the sight. She didn't wave, she didn't grandstand. She just stood there for a moment, quietly, breathing, rooted, ready. 3 weeks later, Gabrielle Reyes sat in seat 1A on a different flight, this time from New York to San Francisco. The leather was still soft, the service crisp, but something felt different. Not because of where she was sitting, but because of how she had arrived. This wasn't the same airline, not exactly. The name on the boarding pass still read Skylux, but behind it now was a new wave of scrutiny, policy, and purpose. Her name was no longer whispered in legal meetings or limited to investor reports. It was spoken publicly, plainly, and with respect. The Open Skies Initiative had been announced industry-wide just 10 days earlier. Airlines across the country had pledged to adopt or mirror the model. Federal transportation agencies were reviewing passenger dignity protocols. And Gabrielle. She'd received over 600 emails from passengers, crew, and complete strangers, black, brown, white, queer, immigrant, each of them sharing stories, some of shame, some of strength. She kept every one. The plane ascended over the clouds, smooth and sure. Gabrielle sipped her tea slowly, eyes tracing the sunlight pouring through the window. She no longer felt the knot in her chest that had accompanied flights for years, the tension of being seen but not believed, present but not welcomed. Across the aisle sat a young flight attendant, new to the crew. She approached with a hesitant smile. "Ms. Reyes." Gabrielle looked up and returned a gentle smile. "Yes, I just wanted to say, I watched your speech, twice. It changed the way I think about how I move through the cabin, how I treat people." My mother cried watching it. Gabrielle reached for her hand. "Then you're already helping change the skies." The attendant nodded, eyes glistening, and moved back toward the galley. Gabrielle closed her eyes briefly. There had been nights when she'd doubted herself, nights when she wondered if speaking up would ruin her professional standing, make her a target, or simply go ignored. But those nights passed, and now, even at 35,000 feet, she felt grounded in something far deeper than altitude. Her phone buzzed softly in her lap, a message from Jordan. "You made the Times front page. Banner headline. The seat that changed the skies." She smiled faintly. Not from vanity, but because the story was no longer just hers. It had become a mirror for millions. As the flight settled into cruise, Gabrielle thought back to the beginning, to the gate agent's dismissive tone, to the flight attendant who looked past her, to the note, the quiet threat, and the louder truth that had come after. She had responded not with rage, but with resolve. Not with spectacle, but with structure. Her strength had not been in confrontation alone, but in reflection, strategy, and sustained action. It wasn't just the seat they had tried to take, it was the legitimacy that came with it. And now, every single policy change bore her fingerprint. Every training manual being rewritten now contained a paragraph inspired by her words. Every gate agent being retrained now heard her name in orientation. A voice came over the intercom. It was the captain, a woman's voice, confident and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Renee Ellison. We're at cruising altitude and expect smooth skies ahead. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to extend a warm thank you to all passengers and a special welcome to Ms. Gabrielle Reyes, flying with us today. Thank you for helping raise the standard." The cabin stirred with light applause. Gabrielle bowed her head slightly, her hand resting over her chest. For once, the spotlight didn't feel isolating. It felt earned, shared, reclaimed. The older gentleman beside her leaned in. "That you they're talking about?" he asked with curiosity. Gabrielle turned to him, warm but poised. "It is," he smiled. "Well, thank you. My granddaughter's a pilot in training. What you did, it's going to make her career easier." Gabrielle nodded, her voice low. "That's the goal." As the flight continued westward, Gabrielle pulled out her journal, the same one from that fateful day on Flight 228. She flipped to the final page and began to write. August 9, 6:24 p.m., somewhere above Colorado. I am no longer afraid to take my seat, because I now know the weight of staying in it, because I know what it costs when we are removed quietly, as if our absence is easier for others than our presence is for ourselves. And because I know this isn't just about me, it's about every person who's had to shrink themselves to fit inside a system built to exclude them. Today, I fly with dignity, not just because I earned it, but because I defended it. Tomorrow, someone else will sit where I once did and not question if they belong. because now they'll know. She closed the journal and stared out the window, clouds stretching endlessly in all directions. They were beautiful, shapeless, and free. The seatbelt sign chimed softly. Her place was secure, not because someone allowed it, but because she took it and never let go. And far above the noise, the politics, the policies, the bruises of bureaucracy, she knew the truth in her bones. When one woman holds her ground, it clears the runway for countless others to lift off. They tried to move her, and instead, she moved the entire industry. Gabrielle Reyes didn't shout. She didn't demand revenge. She demanded change with clarity, calm, and conviction. And in doing so, she gave a voice to every passenger who's ever been told directly or silently that they don't belong. Let this story remind us real power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes, it simply refuses to be erased. The next time you walk onto a plane, or into a boardroom, or even down a crowded street, remember Gabrielle. Remember what it looks like when a woman reclaims her space and uses it to open the skies for others. Because dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right, and discrimination, no matter how subtle, deserves to be called out loudly, calmly, and relentlessly. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you feel seen, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your voice matters, your presence matters, and your seat, you've earned it. Stay tuned for more true stories that challenge injustice and celebrate quiet strength. We're just getting started.